Today is January 27th, 2025, the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. 20 years ago, this date was designated by the UN as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And while many thought that 80 years after the most horrific, systematic, and premeditated crime against the Jewish people, that anti-Semitism would be a thing of the past, yet just last year, we witnessed the October 7th attack and the subsequent worldwide increase in anti-Semitism. From Australia to London to New York and California, anti-Semitism has reared its head in ways that many thought was no longer possible in the enlightened West. To discuss these issues, we're so pleased to welcome Professor Dina Porat, Professor Emeritus at Tel Aviv University and Academic Advisor to Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Center here in Jerusalem. Professor Porat is a worldwide expert on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and we thank you for joining us today, even while traveling to speak at commemorative events at the UN in Vienna. Thank you, Professor Porat, for making the time.
Thank you for having invited me.
My pleasure. I want to start with the day itself. You know, the term liberation of Auschwitz has always been a bit strange to me, since, as we know, there was virtually no one left in Auschwitz to liberate, and the war, with all its terrible consequences, would continue for a number of months. Yet this date has become a symbol, and I'm wondering if you can shed some light on why you think that is.
On what?
On why you think this date in particular has become the symbol.
Sure.
January 27th.
Yeah. Indeed, as you have kindly mentioned, I just came back from a ceremony, quite a moving ceremony, that took place in the buildings of the United Nations in Vienna, where I was exactly speaking to the audience, composed of ambassadors of many countries, dignitaries, one Holocaust survivor, and colleagues and workers in the building. And the question was indeed, what does this day mean, the 27th of January? Well, it is the day that the Soviet army, the Red Army, entered Auschwitz, the camp, and liberated it. But you are absolutely right. Liberation is not an easy word here, since on the way from the camp, just before the Red Army came, there were the prisoners marching on the Death March. So it was still a very sad day, especially taking into consideration the physical and the mental condition of the prisoners. But since then, a lot has evolved, and Auschwitz has become a universal symbol. And I would like to emphasize that. I said in the United Nations that this is not just a Jewish day of remembrance. They are not doing any gesture to the Jews by having this commemoration. Auschwitz is a place of universal evil, not just a place of Jewish commemoration. Please take into consideration that 1.1 million Jews were killed in Auschwitz. That's true, no doubt, a terrible disaster. But 250,000 of others, non-Jews, were killed as well. The gas was tested on Soviet prisoners of war. The so-called medical experiments were not just meant against Jews. They were an attempt to find a method for mass sterilization by which the Nazis wanted to dominate and control European demography, who would be born and who would not be born. Also, 1943, the place became a gigantic slave city. 750,000 slaves of all nations were working hard labor camp. So it has become a universal symbol of evil. And I think this is a main point to be discussed today. Esther, you also mentioned, quite rightly so, the rise in anti-Semitism globally. in all forms right now, from violence in Australia to insults in Britain. It's all over. But again, it is not just a Jewish problem. Of course, anti-Semitism is targeted against Jews, but Jews are targeted by anti-Semites. But anti-Semitism is a problem of society. It shows a public disorder. It can go out of hand. It is an attack or a severe damage to democracy, to values, to the image of the country. You could say safely that it reflects, the level of anti-Semitism reflects the malfunctioning of a society. It reflects its problems. If a regime is one that cannot handle the situation in the country, or that is against minorities, immigrants, whoever is a stranger, then anti-Semitism is on the rise. The more the country is democratic, the more it is open to accept the outsider, the non-familiar, the one we are not familiar with, the less it is anti-Semitic. So again, this day declared, you're right, 20 years ago by the United Nations, the International Holocaust Memorial Day is not just a Jewish day. It is a universal day. It is a warning. Let me also add the following. I don't know how many people know that during World War II, some 65 million people lost their lives. That's a huge number, a terrible number. 20 million only in Soviet Russia, 10 million citizens, 10 million soldiers. These are astronomical figures. So it is not just, of course, this is our terrible, terrible history. And we are the only nation that was designated to be off the face of the earth. But 6 million and 65 others were killed all over. It took years for devastated Europe to be rebuilt, for the wounded to be healed, for the wounds to be cured. Horrible disaster, horrible times. And what was the cause? The World War II was a huge circle. In the midst of it was the Nazi regime. In the midst of it was racial ideology, in the midst of which was anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism was, in fact, and Hitler said it outright, not once and not twice, a major reason for the outbreak of the war that he initiated, which means that extincting anti-Semitism, limiting it, fighting it, is a universal interest. Certainly a European, but not only. It is in the interest of every nation to avoid another world war. Today, a world is again polarized. You have the West, United States, the United Kingdom, and all its Western allies, and you have an axis made of Russia, Iran, China, a few other countries that are against whatever the West is representing. First of all, Israel, which belongs and epitomizes the West. So it is in the general interest of humanity, I would dare say, to limit and fight anti-Semitism. And this day is a warning. It is a warning to do just that.
Thank you, Professor Porat. I appreciate that kind of overview and your thoughts on this. I think you said a lot here to unpack. Some things that I would also, wonder about. I think, in general, we do talk about how the more democratic a country is, the less anti-Semitism we've seen historically. That's certainly been true. I think this year, a lot of people have been surprised that specifically in democratic countries and places, like the campuses and places like that, where you have seen the spike of anti-Semitism. And I think the surprise probably came because it is the democratic, supposedly open university settings that have allowed these kinds of anti-Semitic sentiments, actions, events to flourish in some cases. I'm wondering if you can maybe comment on that. And certainly also, you mentioned the so-called axis of evil of Russia, Iran, China, and certainly Iran's role in pushing an anti-Semitic agenda. It's part of their worldview, we know as well, and their proxies, and how much of that kind of is all playing in together into what we're seeing, if you have some ideas on that. And then the other question that I would ask is, you mentioned that this is obviously anti-Semitism is particularly an issue for the Jews, but it has, universal implications for society at large. What steps can society, or should society, governments, or civil society take to combat what we're seeing today? And also the Jewish community, how can they push back or react or protect themselves?
Yep. Okay, let me first refer to your first question. You
Mhm.
quite rightly mentioned that the campuses in the Northern America are certainly located in a very democratic environment, and still there were so many demonstrations. But please take a look at 2 points. One, these demonstrations, as we've mentioned, went out of hand. They were not just demonstrations against Jewish students or against Israelis and the reaction to the 7th of October atrocities. No, they went out of hand, and they went against American administration, against the authorities of their own university, caused a lot of damage, a lot of physical damage to buildings, to installations. It went out of hand.
Yes.
And one should openly say, uh, uh, as unpleasant as it is, that money is pouring into these universities from abroad. It's not just local donors that you can handle. This is money coming mainly from Qatar, also from Saudi Arabia, some from Iran, but mainly Qatar, by the milliards, not millions, milliards, into the pockets, into the budgets of North American, especially in the US, where the future generation of leadership is growing up and being educated. And this money is buying chairs, is buying tenures, is dictating contents. You should look at what is being taught in departments of the Middle East. It's a Middle East that doesn't exist. So it isn't a simple cut democratic environment, but one that is dictated by money from the outside, one that goes out of hand, and one that relies on a progressive way of thinking that has taken some control in the universities, where the mitzvah, the commandment, is to protect minorities and outsiders, but it does not include Jews, though numerically Jews are definitely a minority. But it says, this progressive worldview says the Jews are white, privileged, they belong actually to the administration, to the oppressors of other minorities, and therefore are not entitled to the protection that other minorities are. So this isn't a democratic worldview, certainly not. Your other question referred to what could be done. Well, this is a difficult question because I can assure you that a lot is being done and still the results are not being seen. But still, I would say that education is for the long run. Until you teach teach first the teachers, give them the material, give them the training to handle all this issue and to overcome the rampant ignorance. People and youngsters certainly do not know what Judaism is. Who are the Jews at all? What's the huge contribution to world culture, starting with the Bible and on? There's a huge ignorance regarding the Middle East too. They don't know a first thing about which river and which sea and who lives in the middle. And so, first of all, ignorance by giving a lot of material, good material to be studied is a first step, but it is in a long run. You'll see the results in years. Legislation, and especially implementing legislation, because there is good legislation against discrimination. And anti-Semitism was declared by the UN a form of discrimination, of racism. So there is definitely legislation, but it should be implemented much more in the universities as well, because what these demonstrators and those who are harassing Jewish students are doing is violating the constitution of the universities, which are based on equality for every student. So implementing legislation is first-hand urgent tool, because if anti-Semitism is indeed a form of racism, of discrimination, you can go to court with that wherever there is a law, and there are laws in most countries against racism and discrimination. And I would again recommend very much, if it's possible, I gave a whole plan to the municipality of Berlin, where they have mixed classes of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish students who know nothing about one another, all the three of them, to have a plan in which Muslim students are being taken to synagogues and to churches, and the Christian ones to mosques and to synagogues, and to homes, and to watch holidays, and to study one about the other. The more we give knowledge and information and data and distribute it as widely as possible about who we are, the more perhaps there is some chance.
That's hopeful. And I would like to leave it on a hopeful note, except I'm going to ask one additional question, and then I'm going to let you go because I know it's a very, very busy day for you. And that is this: there was a recent poll that came out, a multi-country poll that showed that 80 years after the war, after the Holocaust, a majority of people, I don't remember the exact number, a majority of people think that the Holocaust or a Holocaust could happen again. What do you think this means?
Well, this is really, I think, a very pessimistic result of these polls or surveys, absolutely. I'm not sure that all of them meant, those who answered in the positive, meant that another Holocaust would be taken against Jews. But that the Holocaust can happen too in other places. Because look at the world since World War II, no lesson has been learned. And you had Rwanda and you had Cambodia. And just a few weeks ago, the United Nations declared Sudan finally a place of genocide. 2 million Christians are not alive there anymore. So a Holocaust, if they answered so, I think it is not just against Jews, because today there is a state of it. The main difference is, the striking difference is that we have the state of Israel, we have the IDF. Of course, it failed to protect citizens on the 7th of October. We were caught by a terrible surprise, no doubt about that. But we have since then pulled ourselves together, and the IDF has smashed the Hamas and the Hezbollah, and the Assad fell down in Syria, and now we are taking care of the Houthis and Iran. We're thinking of what to do with Iran. So and Israel is an open place for shelter of all Jews, although we are not really fully safe there, but it is a place for Jews. So when they say a Holocaust, if they say so about their local Jewish communities, this is terrible. If they speak in general about the possibility of some war, world war, local war, developing into mass killing, this might be a realistic point.
So just on that one last thing, and then I really am going to let you go. And that is just to follow up on your comments on what's been going on here. A lot of people have been throwing around this term genocide when they're talking about what's going on in Gaza. And I'm wondering, as an expert in both the Holocaust and genocide, if you can respond to that.
No, of course. Of course. First of all, those who are shouting genocide should, first of all, read the United Nations 1948 anti-Genocide Convention, in which the intention of perpetrators is very much emphasized. There is no intention declared by Israel, God forbid, of genociding the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. On the contrary, the government, the army are emphasizing that our war is with Hamas, with the regimes that took over the population and not against the population. You should see how many actions that are not lamentably published or shown by foreign media in cases in which the IDF is warning people that this and that building would be demolished because weapons of the Hamas were hidden there, or they should leave the houses because the tunnel, a deadly tunnel, is going to be exploded. There are many warnings. You don't warn if you want to do genocide. And you should see the host of trucks coming every day to the Gaza Strip with food, with medicine, taken up by the Hamas. Sometimes they take it for themselves and sell it for high prices to the local population, but still fuel is coming in. This is not what you do when you want to genocide someone. So I think the term should be really carefully used, if at all. And certainly those who speak that way should know that the 7th of October showed us that the Hamas Convention, published in 1988, which speaks absolutely about an absolute demolishing of the state of Israel to the last person living, is the real intention of genocide. It's not on our part, it's on their part. And this is what they started doing on October 7, and this is why we reacted. I think all this should be very, very much taken into consideration before speaking about genocide.
Professor Porat, I thank you so very much for your time. I know it's in between meetings abroad, and I appreciate that you're taking the time to share your thoughts with us on this 80th anniversary of the so-called, or the liberation of Auschwitz, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you again, and safe travels. And I would also like to thank my colleagues and for facilitating this briefing, and all of you for joining JPC's briefing in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best.